Today, and poor Oliver had to read a lot of it to get us there. He did a great job with that. But yeah, a lot of stuff to get to as we look at this. A few weeks ago, or a few months ago, we were driving. My family was in the car. We were driving up from Fort Myers, and it was a rainy day. Pavement was hot. You know, the whole thing. And it's like really hot day. Rain just kind of starts pouring down in that Florida way where there's no rain, all the rain. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you're just driving along. You can see it in the distance. You know it's coming, and you hit the rain, all the rain. And so we were in a big SUV at the moment. And as we're driving, that SUV just immediately, as soon as we hit the rain, just starts swerving out of control, just side to side. We're in a lane, and we start moving like side to side. There's nothing I can do to control it. We are going back and forth, and we can feel the car swaying as it's happening. As it's swaying to the side, we're in the left lane, and as it comes to the left, the back of the car fishtails out and actually hits that middle concrete divider in the middle of the interstate. When it hits that, it then spins us around. We now start to go across not just one lane, but into the middle lane, into the third lane, all the way across. We are now broadside across all three lanes of traffic. And I can hear my kids screaming in the background. Oliver is screaming. He's going, "Dad, stop it!" Like it was a joke. Like I was like totally in control of this moment. And this is just one of those funny dad jokes that I do. While Jane is not saying any words, but in Jane format, she's just yelling, "Ah!" Like just a full no words, nothing. Maria's grabbed everything that she can find. She's holding on to every piece of fabric in this vehicle, trying to hold on. And I'm just trying to keep the thing on the road. We sit broadside, seeing three lanes of traffic that have now stopped, fortunately. All three lanes are sitting there just looking at us as we look at them broadside across all three lanes of traffic on I-75. Terrifying moment. And what happened is, if you don't know how this works, we lost the ability to have friction with the road. We lost the traction that the car had, and there is a hydroplane that happens, right? The car was pretty beat up. We had to pull over to the side of the road. We had to get off the interstate and call AAA, and the whole mess had to happen. We had all that, and the car eventually really never got back to normal. We had to kind of total the car. But the reason that this kind of stuff happens, these terrifying moments, is because really, if we look at the simplest version of this, is because there was a friction we had. There was a traction we had with the road that we lost. We lost the ability to have this traction, this friction that we needed to continue to do this, right? Car tires are meant to keep traction with the road, and that actually comes through a thing we call friction. Now, I'm not here to give you a science lesson. That's not the goal today. I'm not smart enough for that. But if you know anything about this, friction is something that is in everyday life. It's something that we have all the time. And actually, it's something that usually puts us in the right place at the right time. So friction is something that you might understand in your, I was watching my son this week. We had basketball tryouts over at the Y, and so he went to go play basketball. And I was watching the Y apparently not swept the courts in a little while, and you could see the kids are sliding all over the place. And what they would do is you'd watch them as they'd go to their tennis shoes, and they would do this because they were trying to get rid of the dirt so that they could keep traction with the floor. They needed that friction so that they could move and adjust to where they were going to keep them in the right place. For some of you, this keeps you in the right place because in the mornings you wake up, hopefully, and you brush your teeth. And we're grateful for that. All of us are grateful, every single one of us. This is something, I wish this was a biblical thing. I wish there was a commandment that was thou shalt brush your teeth, because it just seems like a good thing to do. It's friction that is removing things from your teeth. It's actually cleaning you off. That's what's happening. If you're a soap person, the bar of soap, that's what friction is doing. It's cleaning you off. If you're a loofah person, which is the weirdest thing, really, that is a phenomenon I still do not understand, is the loofah thing. I know it happens. I understand the realities of it, that we're in a loofah world these days. I get that we've moved on from the bars of soap. I get it, I guess. I just don't understand. It just seems filthy that you're just putting this anyways. Doesn't it just seem like you're taking a soap rag that you've been using for day after day after day, and then you're just I'll do it again. I don't know. All my filth's on this thing. Let's try it one more time. And I don't know. I don't get the loofah thing, but some people love it. I remember I had a long fight with a friend early when those came out, and it was this loofah thing, and he kept calling it a LeFou. And I was I don't think it's called a LeFou. He's no, it's a LeFou. And I was it's not a LeFou. He's I'm pretty sure it's a LeFou. And I was no, LeFou is Gaston's best friend in Beauty and the Beast. That's who LeFou is. You're using a loofah, I hope. So if you're using a LeFou, that's a whole other conversation. But I have thought about what if we made a LeFou loofah? That'd be it's a good crossover, and Disney's not paying me enough money for this work. So there's all this stuff we use. Friction every day, it actually keeps us in the place we're supposed to be. It keeps us in the things that we're supposed to be doing. As weird as that sounds. But the truth is we don't like friction. Like we don't really like the way it works. We don't like that there's this part of our life that's going to involve some like sanding down the edges. It's going to involve us having some difficulty, right? It's going to involve like some pain probably along the way. We don't like those things. We don't love hearing that there's going to be pain in our lives. We don't like the idea there's going to be like problems that will arise. We don't like the idea there's a sanding down or a thing that's going to keep us centered, but that's what we need in our lives. That's what we need to make this work. And he's not trying to sell a bill of goods that's not true. That's what I love about what he writes, is it's so honest about the Christian experience. He's not trying to tell you something. He's not trying to get up there with veneers and say it's all just going to work out for you and you're going to have a Rolex and I'm going to have a Rolex and Jesus is going to bless us in health and wealth and happiness. It's not what he tells us. He's writing to a group of exiles, and that's what we've been looking at for the last few weeks. He's writing to this group of exiles that are people that are displaced from their homelands, people who know that they do not look like the world around them. He calls them foreigners. He calls them exiles. He says, you're not citizens of this land because you don't live like the rest of the world. And he's saying, and here in Rome, you're going to have a series of expectations. You're going to have a lifestyle that's in front of you. And guess what? You won't fit into that. You're not going to fit into it too conservatively nor too liberally. You're not going to fit into it in the way that it worships or the way that it doesn't worship. You're not going to fit into any of the formats or the preconceived notions that this culture has for you. You're going to be completely different. And what's going to happen when that happens? So you're going to find friction. You're going to have a lot of friction with the world around you. Good and bad. Right and wrong. You're going to have a lot of friction with the world around you. It's not going to look right. People are going to love you on the conservative side. People are going to love you on the liberal side. People are going to hate you on the conservative side. People are going to hate you on the liberal side. People are not going to agree with you across the board. You're not going to have just a streamlined way of looking at the world that everybody can just agree with or disagree with. It's going to be different. It's going to be hard. And guess what? You're going to have friction. But sometimes that friction is going to be what keeps you in the right place. Right? He writes about this. And again, what you just read, what Oliver just read for us, is what you'll find is he writes about this. If you have a Bible, you're welcome to turn with me to 1 Peter. I'm going to be in 1 Peter like all morning. And we're going to kind of skip around just a little bit because this theme, you'll notice this theme that he uses, it's a different word for like friction. It's a different word for this, but he uses this over and over again. The word he uses is what we would use as the word suffering. He uses multiple words to get to the same thing, suffering. And it's not a word we like. Like you're here right now, and I guarantee you're like, oh, this isn't what I wanted to come to church to hear about is suffering. Like this is not, I want to go to that health and wealth and happiness church. I want that one. I want the one that tells me everything's just going to be perfect and right and everything's going to go good in my life. But guess what? That's not what the Bible talks about, like literally at all. The Bible teaches us not just that suffering is part of life, but it teaches how to suffer well within it. And so what we learn from what he writes, I'm just going to give you a sampling of the scriptures here. Just a sampling. Again, Oliver read some of these for us, but I want you to see, now that you know the word we're looking for, I want you to see how keyed in Peter is to this idea of suffering. Right? So right in the first chapter, every chapter he hits this theme, but the first chapter, verse 6. In all this you greatly rejoice, so that sounds good, that's positive. Now for a little while you may have had to, suffer grief of all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes though refined by fire, may result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Second chapter, he goes into, in the second chapter in verse 18, he says, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only those who are good and considerate, but also those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain and unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. Notice they're suffering. Unjust suffering even. Not even just like just suffering. Unjust suffering. Because they're conscious of God. But how is it that you credit, to your credit, if you receive a beating for doing wrong and you endure it? Well, that's what you're going to do. But if you suffer for doing good, which is the flip side, you'll even suffer not just for doing wrong stuff. You're going to suffer for doing good stuff. You're going to suffer for being right and doing the right thing. Then you're doing good, you're going to suffer for that. It is commendable before God. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you. So much suffering in these verses. Leaving an example that you should follow in his steps, he committed no sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. And when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who rightly judges. In chapter 3, verse 13, Who is going to harm you if you suffer, if you are eager to do good? But if you should suffer for what is right, you're blessed. You're going to suffer for what's right. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer for everyone who asks you the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good. Again, notice most of the suffering in these verses is for doing good, not for doing wrong. You're actually going to do the right thing and suffer for it. For Christ also, again, here's his example, suffered once for his sins, the righteousness of the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. To overmake my point, I'll just keep going because I'm just going to overmake my point. Chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourself with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. He keeps going in chapter 4 in verse 12. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of the glory and of God rests on you. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or as a thief or any kind of criminal. No, that's not the kind of suffering we do here. Or as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. Again, over making my point, but verse 19. So then, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue doing good. Even after that, he goes into the elders. He talks about the elders of the church, and even with them, he cannot help but talk about their suffering. To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's suffering, who also will share in the glory of Christ when he is revealed. Verse 8, be alert and sober mind. Your enemy prowls around like a roaring lion. This is probably talking about Nero specifically, looking for someone to devour. Resist him. Stand firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of suffering. The church around the world is going through the same suffering. And all of God's grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will make himself restore you and make you strong and firm and steadfast. There's a lot of suffering. I don't know if you caught that. It's a theme through the book, something we have not talked about, but it's an important thing, because I think we live in a world where all we want to do is get rid of suffering. Like, we just want to bypass that so bad. We want a frictionless existence. Like, we want things to be frictionless. I was at the Apple store a few months ago, and I had to get my AirPods were having a problem. They weren't working right. And I took them into the store, and they did this little test where they were like, yeah, these are broken and whatever. And of course, they were offering to replace them if I basically just bought a new set. Like, we can replace them. I was like, oh, great. And they were like, yeah, it just costs. And they told me how much it costs. And I was like, that's how much a new set is. They were like, yeah. I was like, that's not replaced. It's not like replacing. That's just me buying a new set of AirPods. I don't think you know how this works. But they do. And as I stood there, I grabbed a new box, because they know how to sell things. I grabbed a new box of AirPods. I stood there for a second, and a guy just came over to me, and I did not go to a register. If you've ever been in an Apple store, you know how this works. I didn't walk to a register. I didn't go anywhere else. A guy came up to me. He had an iPhone out, and he scanned my AirPods with his iPhone. And he said, I can just take your card right here, or you can Apple Pay right on my phone. And I Apple Paid him, and then I thought, like, I hope this guy actually works here. Like, I hope he didn't just buy an Apple shirt. That guy would be a genius if he did that. I think I just paid this guy for AirPods. I'm hoping it's the right person. And I walked out of the store with those. And I remember I asked him, I said, so is this like how you're paying for things now? Like, there's no cashiers, no cash registers. He said, yeah, because we want frictionless payment. We want it to be frictionless. Now, that's what we're doing, right? Like this is why Amazon brings stuff to your door. This is why Walmart across the street over on 54 is having drone deliveries to your house. Now, I've looked it up. I've actually tried to get them to deliver to my house, and they won't do it. It's kind of a letdown. They only deliver, if you know where Walmart is, they will not cross Little Road nor 54. So I think they only deliver to that one brick house with the sheriff outside. That's the only house they must deliver to, because nobody else is over there. That's the only place they go. So that person has great drone delivery and a sheriff. So they're winning. But like, that's the only place I can figure out. But I mean, that's why they're bringing stuff to us, because we live in a world where we want things frictionless. We want it as easy as possible. We want it fast. We want it free. We want it to like move at the pace that we want it to move. That's what we want. We don't want to wait around for stuff. We don't want to have to suffer. In fact, I would say the last thing Americans have ever wanted is to suffer. We are so ingrained with how do I just get out of this? How do I just put some money into it? Or how do I just put some kind of like a Band-Aid over it and just make it so that I don't have to hurt, I don't have to suffer? That's what we're in the mode of. But that's not how life works. And that's not even what the biblical precedent for life is. Timothy Keller wrote a great book on suffering. And I apologize, I'm going to read you way too long of a quote of this book. But Timothy Keller, I think, did one of the best jobs understanding what suffering was. And even later in his life, as he was suffering himself with terminal illness, he wrote a lot of this, understanding this, what suffering looked like. He said this: other cultures have provided its members with various answers to the question, what is the purpose? Like, what's the meaning of life? Some cultures have said it is to live a good life, and so eventually escape the cycle of karma and reincarnation and be liberated. We're going to be taken out of this into eternal bliss. Some have said it's enlightenment, the recognition of oneness, of all things, and of imminent tranquility. Like, we're going to have this perfect peace that's going to come about things. Others have said it's to live a life of virtue or nobility and honor. There are those who teach that the ultimate purpose of life is to go to heaven, to be with your loved ones, and live with God forever. That's a teaching too. But the crucial commonality in all these ways of life is this: in every one of these worldviews, suffering can, despite its painfulness, be an important means of actually achieving your purpose in life. It can play a pivotal role in propelling you toward all the most important goals, like the most important things in your life. One could say that in each of these other cultures' grand narratives, what human life is all about, suffering can be an important chapter or part of that story. But modern Western culture, now we've had that for a long time, but not in our culture. Modern Western culture is different. In the secular view, this material world, this is all there is. And so the meaning of life is to have freedom to choose the life that makes you most happy. Health, wealth, or as we would say, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? However, in that view of things, suffering can have no meaningful part. There's no reason to suffer. It's a complete interruption of your life story. It cannot be a meaningful part of the story. In this approach to life, suffering should be avoided at almost any cost or minimized to its greatest degree possible. In many other cultures, there's a reason for suffering. It's taught that you will suffer. If you've been in any cultures that especially are developing cultures or cultures where it's a country that has maybe still some more disease than we deal with, or maybe there's more poverty than we deal with, or those kind of things, you will see this happen in other cultures where suffering becomes a way of life that you learn from. And we still like that, if I'm being honest with you. Like, go watch, I don't know, a movie. And what you'll find is that main character, they have to experience some form of friction or conflict, or else there is no movie. I don't care what your movie is. I don't care if it's about Luke learning who his father is and trying to take over the empire. He's going to encounter friction. He's going to have conflict. He's going to have to discover if he is the right person to do this and what that means for him. He's going to have conflict along the way. Star Wars has conflict, I don't know, the entire time. That's like the whole point of it. Except for that one where they had some kind of space congress or whatever. Remember that one, the second episode, the original, or like not the originals, but like the second one that came out? That was terrible. What were we doing? Did anybody watch that one? It was like a procedural, like a courtroom procedural. It was terrible. With Jar Jar Binks in the middle of it somewhere. Yeah. But like, I don't care what your movie is. I don't care what your story is. That's a normal part of our understanding. Yet, when it comes to us individually, we're like, oh, I don't like conflict. I don't want that in my life. I don't want that to be part of what I experience. I don't want suffering. I don't want friction. I don't want any of these difficulties. I don't want conflict. Yet, our character never becomes our character unless there's been conflict. Our character never gets to the victory that they so desire unless there's been conflict to shave down the rough edges and to put them in the place they're supposed to be. And we love that in a movie, we love that in a book, we love that in a story, we just don't like it in our story. Yet, Peter's saying that this is a mandatory way of living. This is going to be how we live. Now, I want to give you that's kind of a preamble, and I apologize, I know it's a long way to go. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I just want to give you, as we kind of look through this today, just 3 quick things in suffering and the principles of suffering. Because there are parts of suffering that I want you to see, and this is what I think the readers of Peter would have understood, because the way of Jesus was a way of suffering. And they would have looked at it, and I think they would have had a different understanding than we understand. So I'm going to look at it just through 3 things. Just there's a principle to suffering, there's a practice, an actual practice that comes with suffering, and there is a power that comes with suffering, a power that comes out of that. Something we actually gain from suffering. So if you're a note taker, we're going to walk through some of these passages that he gives us and try to understand these. But the first one I want you to see is just the principle of suffering. People that followed Jesus and knew Peter, they would have known that suffering was a way of life. It's a way of, it's the way you live. It's a normal part of life. This wasn't something they were trying to avoid or get away from. When Peter writes, notice this, I want you to see the principle that he's trying to get at. In the first chapter, he says, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now, for a little while, you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." I want you to see in verse 7 there, he says why it happens. There's going to be suffering, but it's going to happen so that. So that. What I want you to see is he's not just saying it's over, it's just suffering for suffering's sake. Suffering has a purpose so that it becomes something else. So that it goes into this praise and glory and honor. It's going to have more to it than just suffering for suffering's sake. We have to learn that suffering has a purpose, an actual principle to it. There's a reason for what we suffer. It's not about, the problem we have is not that we learn to suffer. Suffering is a normal part of life. We have to learn to suffer, but the bigger question is not just do we suffer or why do we suffer. The real question is what do we suffer for? That's what Peter's trying to say here is let me give you the background to what you're suffering for. What is it that you're suffering for? That's the bigger question. Suffering is going to happen. It's a part of life, but what are you suffering for? Is it worth it? Is it something worth your time and your attention? Is it worth the friction that you're going to experience? What are you suffering for? I mean, Leo Tolstoy had this quote where he would say, "Is there any meaning in my life? Is there anything in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me, like I'm going to die someday, is there any meaning in my life that death does not destroy? Like, is there anything better or bigger than that I'm living for now? Is there something within me?" Peter's saying that that's what we have to live for, is that the suffering is not just going to end here. It's not just going to be part of this. There's a suffering we're going to be for. And it's for a bigger cause. It's going to be a greater cause. And it's not just going to come for doing bad things. Suffering is going to come for doing good things. I'll just say, as people who were following Jesus in that first century, there would have been a real difficulty because there would be people that would have them suffering on either side of things. So for us as Christians, like there might be things that you suffer for. I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't want to sell you a bill of goods that's not true. If we follow the way of Jesus, we're going to have a very strict ethic about certain things. There will be things that people will be like, "Why do you live that way?" Like, why? That's weird. I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but like people who live in the way of Jesus would live differently than the culture around them. Jesus would have hung out with sinners, but he would not have indulged in sin. That's a fine line to walk. Right? He would have been around the things that other people were doing, but he would not have been one who did that. Like, he hung out with prostitutes. Don't think he engaged in that. He hung out with drunkards. In fact, the jingle about him was that Jesus himself was a drunkard and a glutton. That was a song people sang about him. He was hanging out with people like that, drunkards and gluttons. Yet, Jesus would not have lived that way. There's a part of us that it wouldn't make sense to the world around. It's going to create friction. There's a conservative side to us that's going to be hard for the world to deal with, and it's going to create suffering. I'm not going to lie. And I think sometimes we're not sold that bill of goods. I don't think we're told that when we sign up to follow Jesus. I think it's a lot of every head bowed, every eye closed, and then Jesus is going to make everything perfect for you. and he's going to go right for you forever. I don't think we tell people, like, there's an ethic that comes with following Jesus that's going to take some work. And you're going to suffer for it because it doesn't look like the world around you. But I can also say there's another side of the same coin that I think is really, really difficult for us to grapple with. Because there's also a side where, like, we go outside of the religious bounds. We go outside of what the common or the norms would say. We live in a way that people wouldn't expect us to on the other side. Jesus didn't live in the religious world very well. In fact, if you notice, he made a lot of friction that Jesus had in this world was mostly with religious leaders. Almost every argument or disagreement Jesus had, it never came with a sinner or a tax collector or a prostitute. It came with the religious officials of the day. I remember a few years ago, I was at a conference that I was asked to go to. And the conference was about how the church, our kind of denomination, was handling the issue of homosexuality within the church. Like, what were we supposed to do? And this was a few years back, and so we went and we kind of heard out a few different speakers that spoke on the topic, and it was great stuff. Really interesting stuff about Genesis and about Leviticus and about all the different pieces that we see where homosexuality comes up, and it's an interesting topic. And at the end of the day, I think we kind of ended where we began. Okay, I can't find the biblical support for, but the thing I also can't find biblical support for is hating anyone, because I know that God loves them. And that was the part that I walked away from, going like, there's an issue here that we're not seeing, is that I think the same ethic that you would say is the conservative ethic that is biblically true is the same that is a liberal ethic that would say biblically true is that God loves everybody. He does love every single person. I believe that with all my heart. You'll never convince me otherwise. God does not hate anybody. And so we went and we sat in this back room, and this is what got me. This is what really bothered me. So I went to the back room, and I was asked to lead some focus groups around what we had heard in these sessions. And I heard from pastors. I was sitting with pastors from all over the country. And as we talked about what they were experiencing, what they had heard, kind of what did they think that should come out of this? And here's what they came up with, same things. I think that church probably should hold a conservative ethic about sexuality. Now, I also think that the church should hold a conservative ethic about all sexuality. That's the one we don't want to talk about, by the way. Like, we don't want to talk about all the other stuff that comes with the conservative ethic of sexuality, by the way. There's a lot that goes into that. We're pretty cool with most of it, like, if we're being honest. Like, yeah, you watch what you're going to watch. You indulge in what you're going to indulge in. Your marriage, your whatever, your all those things, that's fine. We're okay with that for the most part. This is the one sexual ethic we really don't like for some reason. I heard that from pastors. Like, there was that conversation. But then I heard from pastors saying, but my church is not doing a good job of loving and inviting people in who are homosexuals or people who might see sexual ethics differently than we do. We're not doing a good job of that. And I asked some of the pastors, I said, so what are you doing? Like, what do you do with this? And they were like, oh, I couldn't possibly go, like, in my community and hang out with somebody who has a different sexual ethic than me. I couldn't possibly do that. And I remember asking the question in this room full of pastors, so what's keeping you from doing what you know is right? Jesus would have been with people of different sexual ethics than him. He would have been around them. It wouldn't have been he indulged with it, but he would have been around them. What's keeping you from going to do that? This was the response I got. I don't think other Christians would let me go do that. They were afraid of what other Christians would think about them if they went and did that. There's going to be some friction if you're actually living the way of Jesus on both sides of the conversation. There's going to be some friction that's going to keep you actually maybe in the right place and let you know that this is where you belong. Jesus didn't live a frictionless existence. He did not have a frictionless life. He did not just bounce place to place and everybody go, I love that guy. Everything's perfect. Everything he says makes sense. Everything he's saying I want to follow. I like all this stuff. That's not at all what Jesus did. Again, read through the book of John. You'll find almost every conversation ends with, and they tried to stone him. Almost every conversation he has ends with, and they tried to stone him. It feels really good. But there's a reason, it's not a frictionless existence. It's stuff on both sides of this conversation. And for some of us, we want to live in this frictionless way, but that's not possible for us. We have to have a bigger ethic than that. And it's greater than just what one party or group of people can put you into, what ethic they can put you into. It's not going to fit in a box. So I think that Peter's people understood, and as he's writing, there's a principle that we have to understand about what suffering is and how suffering works. We have to understand it as something more than this. It's greater than just this small little cause or this small little understanding. It's bigger than that, and it's part of our life, and it will refine the edges off of us as it keeps us in the right place. But that's not where he ends. That's not the last thing he talks about. So I want to move, if we can, just into what it looks like in practice. How does this go into our daily lives? What does it look like to practice this? Now, I know none of us are like here and we're like, oh, I want to practice suffering. Like, I want to get better at that. But some of us, we actually need to, because it's actually a Christ-like thing. If you look at what Peter writes in chapter 4, you'll see that, again, he uses this and he says this every single time he talks about suffering, he says that Jesus did it first. This was a practice that Jesus did first. It's something that Jesus did. Notice, he says in chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, since Christ suffered, he actually suffered in his body. He was already suffering. Arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for these evil or these earthly desires or these evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. You have spent enough time in the past doing what the pagans do. You've done enough of that. You've lived in debauchery and in lust and drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. You've done all the things. You've already been there. And they're surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. That's what's going to happen, but they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. You've already done all the stuff. Like you've been around that world. You're going to live differently than that. There's a practice to suffering that we have to learn. And Jesus was not immune to this. The people that follow Jesus, they know that Jesus did this over and over again. I mean, look at the book of Mark. Right in the book of Mark, we see where Jesus shows up. And again, we've talked about this before, but it says, this is with Peter himself. Jesus and his disciples went around to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, who do people say I am? And they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others still say one of the prophets. He says, what about you? Who do you say I am? Peter, the guy who writes this book, says, you are the Messiah. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone, which is that's a terrible marketing strategy. Like any of us would have taken Peter's words there, we would have clipped them, made a video of it, and been like, look what Peter said about us. We got his endorsement. That's something. He said, I'm the Messiah. He says, no, don't tell anybody about that. Don't say a word. And then he says this, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man himself, Jesus, must suffer many things. He must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, that he must be killed and after 3 days he'll rise again. And he spoke plainly about this. And then Peter takes him aside, again, the guy who writes this book, and he begins to rebuke him. Like, Jesus, that's a really bad plan. If you want people to follow you, maybe don't talk about suffering so much. Like, I don't think people want to follow a guy who's always like, I'm going to die and I'm suffering. But Jesus turns and looks at his disciples and he rebukes Peter. Get behind me, Satan. You do not have things in concerns of God in mind, but merely human concerns. Then he calls the crowds to him. So he pulls over the crowds. He's like, hey, you guys heard this whole Messiah thing. It's all going really good right now. Let me give you the pep talk you're looking for. Let me give you the health, wealth, and happiness sermon. Let's go ahead and every head bowed, every eye closed. Raise your hand if you want to follow this. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and forfeit their soul? This is what he gives up. This is the sermon he gives to be like, follow me. How awesome is it going to be? It's going to be awesome. You're going to take up a cross. You're going to follow me. It's going to be great. You're going to have a great time. You're going to deny yourself. You're going to suffer. He never lies to them. He tells them the truth. And Jesus himself actually suffers. We see this even physically. That's what Peter's referring to. In the book of Matthew, it says that they offered up, when the women came to the cross, and they offered Jesus this drink. It says that they mixed gall, and they had this mixed drink. It would have had myrrh in it. It would have been to dull the pain of the crucifixion. But Jesus refuses to drink it. He physically suffers, but even more than that, he spiritually and socially, he suffers. And so people would have followed this and they would have seen this in Jesus, right? What is the one promise Jesus gives us? If you were looking at promises Jesus gives us, by the way, like I don't know if anybody makes a list. You ever make a list of promises Jesus makes? He never promises health and wealth and happiness. He never gives us that promise. One of the few promises Jesus makes you is that in this world you will have trouble. That's a promise that Jesus makes you. Feels pretty good, huh? In this world you will have trouble. That's one of the few promises he makes. And we have this idea that Jesus suffered so that we don't have to. That's like a bill that I've been sold before. So Jesus went to the cross. He suffered for you so you don't have to suffer. That's not true. That's not how this works. And I would say that Jesus suffered so that when we suffer, we can still be like him in our suffering. That's what he did. He taught us how to suffer well. It wasn't that he suffered so you don't have to. It's that you're going to as well. If you're following the way of Jesus, you're going to suffer. There's going to be parts on both sides. There's going to be friction in your life. That's the way it's going to work. But we would be like him as we do it. That's the practice. That's the practice we don't always want to talk about. For me, I look at the pain that sometimes happens when we suffer. There's pain that comes along with it. And that pain, I believe, when we suffer is something that God's using to speak to us. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, he says this: we can ignore even pleasure. Like, pleasure comes and goes if you think about how fast pleasure happens. I mean, how many times have you just had the best moment of your life, and like 30 seconds later, you're like, man, what are we going to do next? Right? I'm not kidding. Like, have you ever scrolled back through your photos for a year and been like, wow, I did a lot of things this year that were really awesome. But you forget them the next moment. But you know what sticks with you? Pain. C.S. Lewis says, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. He's using this to like call us to something. And I don't know if you've ever experienced like pain or suffering. I don't know if you've ever really felt that in your life, but I will tell you, it will call you to do something. You don't just leave it alone, right? I don't know about you. If you've had any pain recently, it makes you do something. Yesterday, I was looking for something that we have here at the church, something I needed, some equipment. And I went down to the back. We have a trailer that sits behind this building. And I went down there last night, and I went to go grab something out of the trailer. And I opened the trailer door, and there were at least 50, probably 100 wasps came out and instantly got me, like 3 different times. I got some stings. And it's just funny because like immediately, like I yelled, and I ran away from that. I wasn't like, this is what pain does. Pain isn't like, well, I'll just hang out here for a little while. This seems like a cool spot. Doesn't bother me at all. No, pain makes you move. It makes you do something about the way you're living, about what you have, the action that you're taking at that moment. By the way, some of the church equipment, just so you know, is now owned by Wasp. I'm not going back in there, and I think they own our stuff. So we'll see if we can pay some kind of ransom and get it back. I don't know, but I don't know what they do. I'm not taking any chances. It wasn't great. Pain makes you move. It makes you do something with what you have. Like you're going to do something about it. And what I find is as I deal with pain or as I've dealt with suffering, it does reveal some things about me. And they're not really good things. Like it's not usually stuff I'm proud of. Like a lot of times pain, when it really hits hard, and when I'm suffering, a lot of times it shows me that this is usually what it shows me, and this is my stuff, not yours. I'm not trying to put this on you. This is me. A lot of times it shows me that I'm like a really selfish person. Because a lot of the pain that I have or the suffering that I've created is stuff that I've created. And you know why I've created it? It's because I want more. Or I want to be better than. Or I have some kind of insecurity that I have not dealt with. Or I have a level of shame in my own life that is driving me crazy. And I realize that that's what the pain is creating in me. It makes you be honest with that. Like it actually creates a way that we have to understand. And I think we try so hard to mute this pain over and over again, don't we? Like if we have any pain in our life, the first thought is medicine and the second is money. Like, what can I do to mute this pain? What can I take? And I'm not saying, like, I get that there are reasonable things to take in your life. I'm not like a Scientologist telling you don't take ibuprofen. It's not where I'm at. I'm just telling you, like, I get that there are things like that, but man, we try to medicate and get rid of because we just are not in a culture that believes that suffering is a part of our reality and thinks that it could teach us anything deeper about ourselves. It's only a thing that's in our way, not a thing that is the way. In the way that Jesus sees it, it is the way of Jesus. Whoever wants to come after me will take up his cross daily and follow me. It is the way. It's not in the way. And for us, I think we just think it's some obstacle. So we try to medicate it away, or we just throw money at it. If I can just get rid of this thing, or just get this thing past, or whatever, get over it, however I need to do that, I'll just throw money at it, I'll get rid of it. And that's how we think we deal with pain. That's how we think we deal with this existence of suffering. We try to mute it over and over again. I see people do this all the time. One author on 1 Peter, Karen Jobes, she's an author who writes about a really phenomenal commentary, by the way, on 1 Peter. This is what she says about pain and about suffering. I like this a lot. It's really good. Even those Christians who do not suffer persecution for the faith are called to the suffering of self-denial. So we may not be being persecuted like these first century Christians, but we have self-denial that's necessary. Sin is often thought of as being motivated by the temptation for pleasure. That's what sin usually is. But perhaps the real power of sin lies in the avoidance of pain and suffering. We try so hard to avoid suffering that we'll actually go into sin instead. We try to avoid suffering so much that we'll try to get away from it, and we will actually sin more by trying to avoid the pain that's coming. We do this all the time. I find for me that when I really suffer a disappointment and understand disappointment and sacrifice, I will tell you, anytime I've suffered real disappointment, what it makes me realize is that my hope is in the wrong place. If I'm disappointed, usually it's because I've put my hope in something that is temporary. Something that is not permanent, something that's not greater than myself. And that's where disappointment comes from. For me, that's what it exposes within me. Thomas Merton says this when he writes about this. He says, suffering merely accepted does nothing for our souls, perhaps except to harden them. But if we use it and we actually do something with it and we see what it's revealing within us, we have the potential to actually use it to learn from. For me, it does kind of three things, and these are not on slides, but just let me give you a couple things that it does for me. Is first of all, suffering, and I've been through a little bit of it recently that just has really rocked me. And I'll tell you, one of the things, it exposes what's going on in me. It definitely exposes what's really my heart's desire. And again, anything that disappoints is usually something that's less than Jesus. And my desire is usually less than that. And exposes those things within me. And it's a painful thing. But it'll let you know when you're not in the right place. Because you put your hope in something that's not Jesus. It exposes those things. It clarifies what I actually do want or what I'm actually after. It definitely clarifies those things. Helps me figure out where I'm really at and how this is supposed to work. And it usually strengthens what I actually do want out of that situation. It helps me strengthen and resolve for what actually does matter in that moment. For many of us, this may be difficult. I don't love this for you, but I'd understand the importance of it. I want to look real quick at the power of this. We'll wrap up here. Let me go back to the power of what this is about. You'll find this in chapter 2 here. Or 3, I'm sorry. This is what he says. This is the power that he gives us when we talk about this. He says, who is going to harm you if you're eager to do good? Even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer for everyone who asks you the reason for the hope you have. But do not do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so those who speak maliciously against you, your good behavior in Christ, may be ashamed of their slander. Notice this line, verse 17. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for his sins, the righteousness for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. That verse 17, just go back to that real quick. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Simply put, it's better to suffer than it is to sin. It's better to suffer than it is to sin. Like, even if it's for doing good, it's better to suffer for doing good than doing evil. Like, it's better to suffer than it is to sin. That's what he's trying to tell us here. For me, that's where this line is drawn and what's really difficult about it. Again, if we don't suffer, we are actually more prone to sin. I know that sounds crazy, but we actually are more prone to move towards sin a lot of times. Now, I don't want to use sin in some kind of gross terms or whatever. Like, sin has all these connotations that it's not supposed to. Sin in the New Testament, and especially in the Old Testament, is a word that just means to miss the mark. Like, there's a perfect bullseye and you're just missing it. And that's not just talking about like some kind of what we think of as the word like iniquity or like this gross, like heartfelt thing. It just means that God designed things just perfectly, and not even just as a perfect understanding of like who he is or whatever. It means that this world was designed to work a certain way. And anytime we're just short of that or just shy of that, that's sin. We're just not living the best way that he designed us to live. And many times that's what we're doing when we sin. And so we start sinning instead of suffering. We'd rather sin. Again, Karen Jobes, as she writes about this, she writes this, and again, really good. Suffering comes along. Timidity and cowardice, selfishness and self-pity, tendencies toward bitterness and dishonesty. All of these are those impurities, those sins of soul are revealed and drawn out by trials and suffering, just as a furnace draws out the impurities of an unrefined metal ore. Finally, we see who we really are. Like, that's what this suffering can do for us, as Timothy Keller writes. He says, this is what suffering does for us. It pulls these things out of us. It's like fire working on gold. Suffering can destroy some things within us and purify and strengthen other things, or not. It depends on our response. The fiery furnace does not automatically make us better. The suffering doesn't make us better, but what we come out with can make us better. I find this interesting. It can change our values. It can change the way we see things. I was just reading the other day about, I didn't mean to talk about this necessarily, but I was just reading about this the other day. There's, have you ever read like the understanding of like, David Musgrave, who is the guitarist for Metallica for a number of years. He got kicked out of Metallica. Apparently the other guys were like, hey, you're not like hardcore enough. I don't know what it was about. I really couldn't tell you. They were like, maybe get more tattoos or something and let's talk. Whatever. And he was in this band for a number of years. And he was part of the founding group of Metallica. And he left Metallica because they kicked him out. And he made this ideal situation in his mind where he said, you know what I'm going to do is from this problem, this suffering in my life, this friction that I've created, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a band and we will outsell Metallica. That was his dream. His dream was, we will outsell Metallica, we will be better than Metallica, we will be bigger than Metallica. And he started another band. The band was called Megadeth. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. He started a band called Megadeth. Megadeth has, to this day, had multiple platinum albums. They have sold out stadiums all over the world. They've had a huge career. Megadeth's actually done very well. But in the last interview I saw with Dave Mustaine, he actually starts crying in the interview. And he breaks down into tears because he still felt he never reached his dream of being bigger than Metallica. He had a great career. Everything had gone really, really well. He made millions of dollars. He made millions of albums sold. It was a big deal. Yet he never felt good enough because he could not understand. He never got to that dream that he had, this reality that he'd created. I want to become this person who outsells Metallica. Yet a few months later, there was another guy that I watched this interview with. And you may have heard of him. His name's Pete Best. Anybody know who Pete Best is? Yeah, he was the first drummer for the Beatles, right? Yeah, so before Ringo came in, Pete Best was the original drummer for the Beatles. And he got very much that thing you do, like right out of it. Like it was like he was a drummer and he was apparently decent. He was fine. There was some conflict that maybe Ringo's mom had or Ringo had some better connections or whatever, and Pete Best didn't have them or whatever. But long story short, Pete Best gets replaced by Ringo. He gets kicked out of the band. and he gets replaced by Ringo. Pete Best did not get to go on all the tours and become one of the Beatles that we look at today. He wasn't one of those guys. Like, he didn't have that career. He actually lost all those things because he was no longer in the Beatles. And he never really recovered. He never had he tried the Pete Best band and the Pete Best experience, and it wasn't much of an experience. Nobody really went to it. Nobody really cared. But his interview, I watched an interview with him, and his is fascinating because he's so happy. And he said, you know what happened is I got kicked out of the Beatles. And he said, but if that wouldn't have happened, he said, I never would have met my wife. I never would have had the kids I had because we would have been on the road all the time. I never would have been the person that I became. And he was so happy about it. Two people with two very similar experiences. This suffering created one in one very specific way and turned the other into a completely different person. That refining by fire that Tim Keller's talking about, it's going to reveal things within you. It's going to challenge you a little bit, but it's going to show who you really are at the end of the day. Like, that's what's going to happen. Two different people might have very different experiences. I think Pete Best also was a little bit happy because he did show up in that documentary that was on Disney Plus recently, the Get Back one, and he did get $8 million just for being in the background of that. So he did all right. It's worth it. It was good. But you have these two wildly different paths, and that's what it reveals within us when we start to see suffering the way that Christ sees it. Is something it's going to actually refine us and make us better. But many of us, we're more tempted to take the easy route, which the easy route is actually to sin over to suffer. Again, that's what he's saying there is do not let that happen to you. Karen Jobe, one more time, when she writes about this, she says, ultimately, this is the last, maybe I missed this altogether. I'll skip this. I'll go on. Sorry. But she said, there is one passage there. Let's go to that David Benner quote because I love this. He says, ultimately, we need meaning that will be strong enough to make suffering sufferable. What is it in your life that actually makes this suffering that you're going to experience, what makes it sufferable? But for meaning to be useful, it has to help us live a life as it actually is, not as we wish it could be. We have to live the way that life actually is, not as we wish it could be. And for suffering to be sufferable, we have to have something greater than us and meaning greater than us. Now, I'm just going to say, earlier in this service, we sang a song that said these words. Nothing is better than you. Oh, there's nothing that's better than you. We sang that. Those words may have come out of your lips as well as mine. The question when it comes to suffering is, do we actually believe that? That there's nothing better than this way of Jesus that we get to follow. The example of Jesus' suffering that we get to follow into today. That will refine some things in our lives. It will create friction, but it will ultimately keep us right where we're supposed to be. Do we actually believe that about this way of Jesus? Do we believe that about him? That there's nothing better than him? If we believe that, there's something greater than us that we believe in. And there's a reason that we will suffer, and will suffer well in this world. And we'll be people who may not fit into a box or into a certain mold. We will be people who bring a kingdom that is not of this world to this world. That only comes by being citizens of a different land. My hope is that we're those kind of people. And so it's going to cause friction. It's going to cause suffering. It's going to cause pain. But if that pain is revealed within us, our hope is that we get to see eternal glory, something that's greater than and bigger than any form that this world has to offer us. That there's nothing better than the way of Jesus. And we have to firmly believe that. So if you would, we're going to close this morning. And we are going to sing together. It's a song you probably know. And maybe you're in a spot right now where you're in the middle of suffering. Maybe you're in the middle of there's some difficult things going on. And maybe you're not seeing how God's using this, to be honest, in your life. Maybe you're not fully understanding it, and that's okay. My hope is that you start to see how God's working even in this difficult situation. How is he working even in this tough time? How is he working in refining you in this space? And maybe you need to take some notes about that. God, what are you revealing to me? God, what are you showing me in this time? God, what are you making? Who is the person that you're making me to be? What are you revealing within me? And maybe you need to ask yourself if you really believe that there is nothing better than the way of Jesus in the midst of this. And then realign yourself around that as the most important thing. But as we sing, we're going to sing that even when we don't see it, he's working. And it may not feel like he's working. This may feel like a really tough spot that you're in. But maybe this is exactly where you're supposed to be. Because this is the way of Jesus. This is how he lived and how we live. We're going to sing that even when we don't feel it, he's still working. That he's still working even in these tough situations as we suffer, that we would suffer well.